I postponed the introduction of this chapter to a later week in the semester so that it could coincide with some of the information that you were reading in your primary text in it this week. The issues of ethnic diversity in our society is something that really has been pressed onto our consciousness, probably correctly and properly, but it has been pressed onto our consciousness nationally by some historical and social changes that have occurred in the last 50 or 60 years. Of course, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s and beyond, because it continues to exist today, is one of those very, very important things that brought the issue of ethnic diversity in our society into our consciousness as a nation. And when we think of civil rights movements, we tend to think about African Americans, but really the movement itself involved much more than African Americans. Really, the issue of diversity involves many, many different groups and has for quite a long period of time. In California in the 1960s and 1970s, Cesar Chavez was a very well-known Hispanic activist for migrant workers in California and trying to improve their conditions as well. And so ethnic diversity is something that historically has been brought to our attention, and issues related to that, which include poverty, because those individuals in minority groups, while there may be a higher number of Caucasian individuals living below the poverty line, when you look at the percentages per capita issues regarding poverty, your chances of living in poverty are much, much greater if you belong to any minority in the United States. Martin Luther King, in fact, was beginning to turn the attention of the civil rights movement to poverty from race, in fact, at the time of his assassination. I think maybe recognizing that that was more of the core issue anyway. Another thing that socially has been changing, of course, is the influx of immigration that we've experienced in the last 20 or 30 years or more in the United States, particularly with the Latino and Hispanic populations moving into our nation in ever increasing numbers. And this is brought up, as you are aware if you pay attention to the news, many issues regarding questions about our boundaries, national boundaries, and how secure they should be, how well patrolled they should be, issues about unemployment, about the changing culture, and literally the changing face of America that has a great debate going on in the halls of Congress and in our national political circles about immigration practices and policies. And so it's with all that in mind that we look at this particular issue this week. Now, there's a number of different issues, I guess, the things that you hear about when the issues of ethnic diversity come up. And so I want to go through some of these terms and help to define what some of this means as we go forward. Affirmative action is listed here as the first concept or phrase that we need to be familiar with when we talk about ethnic diversity, and it's something that's really controversial and at the same time very misunderstood. In fact, affirmative action refers to the steps that are taken to eliminate discrimination, and this can be in areas including employment, education, contracting, housing, etc., etc. And it's also intended to redress the effects of past discrimination. The underlying motive for affirmative action programs is the constitutional principle of equal opportunity, which holds that all persons have the right to equal access to self-development. Now, this is controversial, as you know, in our society, partly because there are a number of individuals in the majority group, largely white males, who have challenged affirmative action practices and policies because of their feeling that they were excluded from being hired or being admitted to institutions of higher learning in favor of minority individuals who had lower scores perhaps or less qualifications in order to fill what are known as racial quotas in hiring and in education. Now, there have been a number of different rulings with the Supreme Court over the years. A very important one was the Bakke decision, I believe in 1983, which seemed to, Bakke was a white applicant to medical school at Berkeley, I believe, who was not admitted to the school, the University of California's program, and believed that he was excluded in order to allow individuals of minority groups into the school, even though they may have had lower scores. Now, there's a lot more to this story than has kind of survived this, and it isn't quite as simple as that. And if you're interested in this decision, I would encourage you to read more, even going to Wikipedia, you're going to learn some things about this that aren't commonly known. That is that he had applied a number of different times, and that Bakke was certainly not the only student, nor the student with the highest score who was not admitted to the school that year. But he was the one that I guess cried the loudest or whatever. So he's the one that took this, and eventually this case found its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court seemed to rule in favor of, well, it did get Bakke admitted to school, but it seemed to rule in opposition to affirmative action. And in fact, I believe the court decided at that time that using racial quotas alone was not a good reason to exclude individuals from admission to schools. But first of all, there are many of other factors that might be involved in that decision as well, but aside from race. But beyond that, there are many different kinds of affirmative action. And if you get an opportunity to take a diversity class, this is something that I strongly encourage you to do, not only because it will increase the sensitivity and understanding of a lot of different concerns regarding ethnic groups, but also because the concept of affirmative action, I think, is explained much more fully. And it includes things like reaching out to underserved populations to encourage them to apply, and those kinds of things. It isn't all about quotas. And in fact, some of the decisions of the court in the last 20 or 30 years has also upheld the concept of affirmative action. And so this is a big issue. In fact, it's something that was a concept that actually was added to the latest edition of this textbook compared to one that I had used earlier. And so it is an issue that is very modern day. Assimilation refers to the blending in of immigrant populations into the larger culture. So the concept is, this is sort of the melting pot idea of the United States, that when individuals from different cultures come to the United States, they join in and become a part of the dominant culture. They assimilate the culture, take on the characteristics and practices and beliefs of the larger culture, the language as well. And this is something that many people, particularly those in the dominant culture, believe is a positive way of responding to diversity. Others have big issues with that. Color refers to the degree of pigmentation in one's skin, I believe, and that's pretty much what it amounts to. But we use color as a basis for race, even though there are many, many other factors associated with race. And race itself, in fact, is really a social construct, much more than the biological concept that we tend to believe that it is. Culture involves the practices, beliefs, foods, patterns, languages, and things of a group of people. That's the culture. So individuals coming from other parts of the world bring a different culture into our own at the time that they move here. Ethnicity regards more the characteristics of people that distinguish them from others. Ethnicity groups that are singled out in the United States include Native Americans, interestingly, although they're the original Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and so on. Discrimination is the unequal or preferential treatment of individuals or groups. Sometimes, well, it can be based on any number of different factors, but in this particular discussion, we tend to think of discrimination as being related to policies and practices that exclude members of minority groups in one way or another. Integration is the blending of different groups into one setting. That's, I think, kind of understood pretty easily. Minority status, which is sometimes misunderstood, has to do with numbers. And so, does not have to do with numbers. It has to do with relative power. And so in any society, a smaller group can be a majority if they have more power based upon the institutions of society. You often hear of hand-wringing that goes on among the white dominant culture in the United States that immigration is changing the face of America, and that whites will no longer be the majority in another 20 or 30 years, and what is that going to mean for the course of America? Well, I think it probably means that America is going to be a much richer and diverse society, much more lively society than perhaps it's been in the past. But it does not mean that whites are going to become minority, even if they are. Well, they're still going to be the largest group, even if they're no longer above 50% of the population. But even setting that aside, because whites have control of the institutions in our society, Congress and the legislatures all over the United States, businesses and corporations and banks and those kinds of things. Whites are the ones who are in charge and control most of the rules that are developed and laws that are made. And so whites are in the majority and will continue to be long after their population falls below 50% of the United States population. I think it's very safe to say. Multicultural, just like it reflects, suggests that a society has many different cultures that are blended into it. Now, multiculturalism is actually very different from assimilation and from that melting pot. Father Michael Alexa refers to multicultural societies more as as opposed to being a melting pot where everything is blended into one, it is more like a tossed salad where many different groups, many different flavors, let's say from the many different cultures, can blend into one experience, and each brings its own richness to that particular society, not being blended into it, not being homogenized into it, but by standing out as something different. Another term for that sometimes, as you see below, is pluralistic. They're really kind of used interchangeably oftentimes, but we tend to see ourselves as a multicultural, pluralistic society in America, but we certainly are not. We are a society that really focuses upon assimilation. Multiracial, of course, many different races in any one society. Race itself, as I said to you, is really much more of a social construct. You may be black in the United States, but if you go to Brazil, you may be considered white. It depends upon a number of different things, not just the color of your skin, but also the cultural definitions of the races and those kinds of things as well. And there are those who believe that we make far, far too much of race in this nation. We are the only nation in the world, or at least we're the first, I believe, to use race as the defining characteristics in a slave society that we had here prior to the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. Racism is the use of race to discriminate, or using race to discriminate against members of a minority group. It can also be turned against a majority group too, so that individuals of minority groups can be racist and have prejudices and act discriminatorily, I suppose, towards members of the minority group or the majority group as well. However, again, the bigger picture is the majority group is the majority, and so they have ways to escape that kind of, if you want to call it, reverse racism that members of the minority do not have. Segregation is the separation of groups. In this particular case, we're talking about race or ethnic groups, racial or ethnic groups. Single race populations would be populations where really there is just one race, and social class, which is your socioeconomic status, in part is based upon race, but more so in the United States is based upon things like education and your occupational prestige and those kinds of things. And so a lot of things that and I've told you this before, I'm sure, a lot of things that we attribute to being due to race, the kinds of things that people do or the way they act, or the way they accept or don't accept the system in society, has more to do with social class, socioeconomic status, than it has to do with race. And so that's a key thing. Social class is really much more important in defining how we act and feel and the beliefs that we hold as we approach society and life in general than our race does. A subculture, these concepts are really kind of just thrown in, mixed together. They have no logical progression, but a subculture is really a culture within a larger culture. And subcultures generally, well, they can be subcultures generally are a part of the larger culture and just have some unique characteristics, like say, that set it apart from the larger culture, but in large part participate in the larger culture as well. A counterculture, on the other hand, would be a smaller culture of individuals or whatever that break away and have values that oppose a larger culture. But subcultures generally accept the values of the larger culture. Even if, in particular, a lot of our minorities in the United States, those subcultures accept the values of the larger culture in the United States, they still oftentimes are denied access to the resources so that they have equal opportunity because of discrimination and racism and those kinds of things. The United States population is somewhere around 310 million people, and about 72% of those people in censuses are listed as white. Now, it seems that number almost doesn't seem possible given the fears that the let's say the white, well, I don't want to say white supremacist, but the larger majority culture often expresses about becoming a minority in the United States. I believe the last I heard, the year that whites were no longer going to be the majority was 2035 or 2045, somewhere in that area. Um, how important is that? I don't know that it's important at all. I really don't believe that it is. But the racial and ethnic group that experienced the slowest rate of growth over the past decade also was white, and that again has a lot to do with immigration of other ethnic groups into the United States, um, as well as a number of other kinds of cultural factors. People of Hispanic origin or Latino origin, it depends, because these terms sometimes are used interchangeably, and they really do refer to different groups. Although again, that's the official United States Census Bureau labeling of anyone with Latino or Hispanic background is Hispanic, and so people of Hispanic origin comprise the largest ethnic or race minority in the United States. It is interesting that a lot of federal forms that you fill out when you do indicate race will say white, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic, implying that the federal government is beginning to move Hispanics into the white category as far as census taking is concerned. And it's just kind of an interesting phenomenon. This is not the first time this has happened. In fact, Jewish persons, when they came over in early 20th century, were not considered white. They were considered a separate ethnic group. Southern Europeans, Southern Europeans and Middle Europeans, like, for instance, my own Hungarian ancestors and Italians, Greeks were seen as not white also at the time that they arrived, and were seen as a separate ethnic group. And when the war came around, when World War I came around, and eventually World War II came around, suddenly these people were all white. And I guess when the nation needed them to be a member of their fighting force, then it was okay to call them white. So this again kind of emphasizes the social construct around the issue of race and perhaps even ethnicity in many respects. I mean, it's an artificial category. Ethnicity is expressed in the ways people regard and deal with the crises of their lives. And so, depending upon your ethnic group, your customs, your attitudes and behaviors with regards to things such as pain, violence, dependence and independence, what's verbalized and not, your ability to accept help, your ability to experience or express emotions, and so on, these differ from group to group. So your culture really defines the way that you in some respects perceive reality, and in the way that you express that perception and interact with others. Some cultures are very, very focused upon independence and not on seeking help, particularly from the dominant culture. Some cultures have their own mutual aid traditions that are practiced, so that you don't tend to go to counseling services, let's say, or you don't tend to go to government agencies for assistance. And when you do so, it's really considered a very negative experience in some respects. Other cultures are not like that at all. But in any event, from culture to culture, individuals' acceptance of, for instance, the social worker's role in their life or their presence in their life are going to be very different, and will not necessarily be warm and accepting, even though from our perspective they may need our intervention. So all of this suggests that as social workers we need to be sensitive to the differences that exist in the many different cultures that we encounter in our work. This means having a good knowledge of the cultural group's past history, because this is something that continues to have effects today on how individuals in that group perceive themselves, perceive the larger society and their relationship to it. We need to be knowledgeable and sensitive to the meaning of the group's present status to those individuals, as you know, and as not only as it relates from their history, but also in how they exist today and what this means to them. As workers, we need to be aware of the policies and practices of our agency as it relates to ethnicity and cultural differences, and to be also aware of the impact of the often conflicting demands that weigh on people of any one culture. The Alaska Native culture is one that is one to kind of refer to here, which is that the elders in the older individuals in many of the native cultures continue to want their young people to respect their culture and to be more a part of those practices than of the modern day culture in the United States. And yet many of the young people find that it's impossible to do that and to become a part of the larger culture. And so sometimes we'll break away from or reject some of the values of the original culture in order to blend in more and assimilate into the larger dominant culture. This creates a lot of problems in the family systems, and also can at times create psychological problems for the young individuals who are breaking away from those cultures as well. Barriers to communication, particular rules and everything to communication. We talked about this a few weeks ago in the unit on effective communication with clients, and we talked specifically about Father Alexa's ideas about the differences in communication practices. And also to be aware that ethnic groups are not monolithic. And I referred to this a little earlier, in mentioning that Hispanics and Latinos are different groups. Hispanics generally considered to be more the European sort of Spain and that particular region, and the Latinos much more so those of the origins of South America and Central America. And so we tend to see them monolithically as Hispanics or Latinos, and think that they're all alike when they come from many, many different cultures. Likewise, Asians, Thais are very different from Chinese, who are very different from Japanese, who are quite different from East Indian. And for that matter, in Native American populations, whether it be Alaska Native or it be any member of a number of tribes in the lower 48 as well, there are many differences in terms of Native Americans' cultural practices and beliefs as well. And so while we may tend to group them into larger subcategories, let's say, or larger categories in order to just to categorize them, so to speak, we have to keep in mind that there are many, many subgroups that have very distinct differences within those larger subcategories. For some reason, this particular chapter takes on the topic of systems theory and working with people, and I don't know that it's necessarily has its place. There's nothing to say that it doesn't have its place in this chapter, but this just seems to be kind of a interesting place for them to put it. But systems theory really implies that that a family is a system, and that in order to understand what goes on in a family as we intervene with that family and how to bring about change, we have to recognize that the parts are all interconnected, much like an engine runs with various parts. And if you do something, let's say for instance an automobile engine, and you screw up the carburetor, the entire engine stops working effectively, and sometimes the automobile will continue running, and for, I don't know, maybe not with the carburetor, but with some part or other that goes awry, and it may hurt the other parts of the engine to do that, but it can continue to run for a period of time. This is the same thing kind of that families do. Families when a family functions successfully together, whether even if there's illnesses and differences in the family, the family has a sort of a dance that they have with each other, so that even around someone's illness or their dysfunctional behaviors or adjustments, there's a certain understanding and agreement among individuals so that they can continue functioning day in and day out without stepping on each other's toes, so to speak. This is one of the reasons why a lot of times people, while we talk about alcoholism as a disease, really we also talk about alcoholism as kind of being supported by the family system, so that when the alcoholic becomes sober, things have to change in other parts of the family system as well. And why it is sometimes it is believed that the family system encourages the alcoholic to start drinking again, because they were more comfortable with the dance. They knew the dance before. So this is a little bit of systems theory. And as I say, it just seems to be kind of a little out of place in a particular chapter here, although not really. But so workers have to be able to define the boundaries of a particular system, who they're working with, the family basically, or it could be a community, it might be just a couple, it could be a number of different things, a work group. And within that system then, they have to recognize that there are channels and patterns of communication that are approved and some that are not, and to learn the explicit and implicit rules in relationships. Again, I have the family system here, but it could be any system that they're working with. That there are rules that are clear, and there are also rules that are underneath that aren't spoken, and that maybe are never verbalized, and yet are very clear when you observe that system. So observation is a part of the skill, I think, in working with any system, a family system or otherwise. And in any system, there is a concept called stasis. This is or homeostasis, which is a balance that exists among parts. And this is what I was talking about that particular dance. That's sort of like the homeostasis. Everybody's moves, everybody's approaches to particular topics are more or less coordinated. You get to be that way when you live together or you work together for a long period of time. So when one part changes, the other parts are going to have to change as well. And so oftentimes not wanting to change those other parts, even if they identify the part that needs to change, so to speak, is dysfunctional, they may not want to make the changes they have to make. So therefore, they kind of push the dysfunctional piece to continue in its dysfunction. So that's why we say the push to maintain the status quo competes with the push to change, which generally we think would come from us. We are also a part of many social systems, and this includes our work site, and so we have to be conscious of that as well, and be aware of the fact that those communication rules exist, the patterns of communication exist, the relationship rules exist, there are boundaries and those kinds of things within our own systems at home and at work that impact on how we do things as well. And this would also be rules that maybe don't exist in our current family, the family of our procreation, let's say, but may have existed in our family of orientation or origin that continue to affect the way we act today. But whatever way you approach it, there's going to be conflict, because in growth there's always some conflict, and it can be seen as an opportunity, not as something to avoid. Avoiding conflict oftentimes means there is no change. Now for some concepts in the families as systems as well. By the way, I want to mention to you that there are a few pages in the book that spell out different theories in family systems work and those kinds of things that I think are very useful. It's table 4.1, different models of family therapy that use systems theory. And if you go on into grad school and you take up clinical social work practice as a part of your training, you'll become very familiar with those particular models. But as far as concepts go and what different kinds of terms that are useful to know in working with family, here are some of the more important ones for you, as you can see. First of all, boundaries. Boundaries sort of are those lines that are drawn between individuals or groups of individuals within a system that define maybe where the rules change, something like that. Sort of the invisible membrane that surrounds each set of relationships or subsystems within a family. For instance, parents, they're generally it's considered in most systems theory at least, that there is a boundary between parents and children, a healthy boundary. And so children don't participate in everything that the parents do together, right? Parents have different rules than the children have. Likewise, the children may engage in certain behaviors that the parents don't engage in as well. So that's a boundary. Now, a boundary doesn't mean it's a wall. It may be a permeable boundary. Communication can flow back and forth, and in most healthy systems, most boundaries are permeable so that information can flow back and forth between the two. And this is one of the things that keeps the system alive, is that constant communication back and forth. When the boundary becomes solid, when it becomes a wall, that's oftentimes when systems will fall apart. I don't know, families, they're defined in the book as rules govern systems with a tendency to stability or homeostasis. And so this is just another, in this particular theory, is just another type of system that we're talking about where there is this desire to have a balance in the relationships and everything. And again, understand that as an intervener, when we step into that and we begin to make some changes, let's say even if the family is requesting those changes, we upset that homeostasis, and that creates conflict, and we have to be around to kind of help them put it back together again. Feedback is that communication back and forth between systems, or between the worker and the family, or between the family and the community, between the worker and their superiors, children and parents, that kind of thing. It is information that goes back and forth, essentially, that allows a family or a system to regulate the system's behavior. Positive feedback generally is considered to be something that generates change and variation. Negative leads to stability and homeostasis. And generally it's considered that a balance between the two types of feedback is necessary for a family system or any system to function optimally. Homeostasis, I've already defined as sort of a stability, that dance that we were talking about within the system. A hierarchy, we know what that term is, and in the concept of systems is pretty much the same thing. Those that are governing, let's say, and those that are governed. The relationship of individuals or subsystems in a family or in any system with each other. That's the hierarchy. Subsystems in a family, the children, the parents, or it could be the older siblings and the younger siblings. It could be sometimes in unhealthy families, the men against the women, or the father and son against the mother and daughter, or the vice versa. Sometimes subsystems exist pretty much all of the time, but when they become strong and become the dominant system, sometimes in a family system, it can become, or any system again, it can become harmful. A super system, we talk about the ecology of an individual, the environment of that individual that they live in. The super system is the larger community, the larger physical, economic, and interpersonal environment in which the system, in this particular case, the family system, exists. So those are some concepts. As a few final thoughts, at least in terms of social responsibility, when we talk about ethnic diversity and I guess working with families as a system also. Personal and institutional racism, social pressures and policies that affect different ethnic groups can destroy people in spite of their best individual effort. And while it is up to the individual to do the best they can, to deal with those pressures and those influences, and the individual is responsible for their own behavior, nonetheless, workers have a professional responsibility to try to change the circumstances in which this individual exists. And so this would imply that in working with, say, inner city minorities or whatever, it isn't enough to just kind of help those individuals get jobs and get try to scratch out a living, let's say, with marginal employment and those kinds of things. Necessarily, I think it also involves participating in trying to change the community and change the attitudes about the community to develop more opportunities that are more promising for those individuals as well. So we have to try to change the kinds of things that limit the access of our minority clients, or limit the advancement of our minority clients. But, we have a job to do, and we're paid to do a certain thing, and we only have a certain amount of time, and we have our own life to live as well. And so we do have to decide, based upon our own particular abilities, as well as the amount of time that's available to us, how much we will be involved in attempting to change destructive social factors. But I do say, I think it's incumbent upon social workers to try to set aside some time, some activity to participate in larger scale social change as well. In this society, there's an ever-increasing number and increasing variety of ethnic groups that really kind of require us to prepare ourselves for ethnic-sensitive practice. This will mean studying this particular topic far more than reading a couple of chapters in an overall introductory course about social work, but really kind of getting to know the different groups, studying diversity more intensely. If you don't find this in your educational program, ask for it. Pressure your school or your instructors to bring more information into your education about diversity, because this is something that's going to be very, very vital. Alaska and Anchorage in particular, I think are really is amazing. Some of the ethnic crossroads that exist in Anchorage, for instance. I once read that there are something like 150 different languages that are spoken in the households in the Anchorage school district, based upon the surveys of the students when the school year begins. That's amazing. That's amazing for a community the size of Anchorage. And so, there really, when we talk about ethnic diversity and the need to be sensitive to ethnicity, we are talking about practice right here in our home communities, as well as other places around the United States, perhaps even more importantly here. We have to know the cultural history and differences of their groups, and to respect that, and I think it's worth it, particularly if you're working on a longer term basis with clients, is to sit down with them and find out what they see about the history of their group, what they understand about it, what they know about it, how they see that impacting them today. Understanding also that what they see consciously may not necessarily be the whole picture, because there are subconscious processes that also come into play in this. But anyway, that conversation is a good conversation to have with your clients. And then the other thing is to have a willingness to work to change social situations, attitudes, and behaviors of those both in the majority controlling group and in the minority groups as well. And so that sums up this chapter. I hope that you find this information worthwhile to you and useful. Again, I think this fills some of the gaps that exist in the discussion of this topic and in our larger textbook. If there's any questions you have about this, please do let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk with you again next week.